Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Your Project Shepherd Construction podcast. My name is Curtis Lawson with Shepherd Construction Advisors, and along with my industry expert friends, I am here to guide you through these 4 key components of a successful project, which are demonstrated by this simple drawing of a house. The foundation is proper planning. The left wall is your team, the right wall is communication, and the roof is proper execution. Have all 4 of these components in place and your project will succeed. Whether you're building or remodeling a custom home, or if you're an architect or designer looking for inspiration, or maybe you're just interested in building science and high-performance construction, you're in the right place. Please help us further our mission here by tapping that follow or subscribe button, push that notification bell so that you know when our new episodes drop every week. And now, let's get to today's interview. Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the Your Project Shepherd podcast. I am excited today to be joined by Morgan Reinart. Morgan is a partner in Old Home Rescue and Preservan, which is based in Oklahoma City. And they also have a podcast and a YouTube channel. Although Morgan and I were just chatting, it's something that they're kind of revamping, but I still wanted to mention that if you're interested in the stuff that we're talking about today, definitely go check out their YouTube channel and their podcast and learn more about these topics. So Morgan, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. First off, Curtis, I have to commend you. You are the first person to ever pronounce my name right on the first try. So nice job there.
Thanks. Well, I was actually listening to some of your stuff last night on YouTube. I was like, I have to get his name right and I have to get some details right. So I did my homework on this before we started. So tell us about Old Home Rescue and tell us about you and what your personal history is and how you got into historic. Oh, you know what? I should back up and just tell everybody that today's topic that we're talking about is historic structures and preservation, restoration of historic structures. And so I should probably have led with that's what we're talking about today. So
yeah.
Morgan, tell us about kind of your experience in that, how you got into this and what you guys currently do.
Yeah. So I actually have a degree in biology and health and sports science. I was on the path to being a pharmacist, applied for PCAT, or I was going to take my PCAT, applying for pharmacy school. And then I just woke up one morning and I was like, man, this doesn't feel right. Something is off with this. And I always wanted to be working with my hands. My parents bought a $7,000 house when I was like 10 years old. Everybody in town thought they were tearing it down to build a new house. And my dad remodeled one room and then we moved into it like 2 months later. And then it was, I think he's about 80% done now, like 20 years later. But that was my first introduction, being like 10 years old. Helping him reside a house and living through that process. But I went to college thinking that was the normal path. Felt like I had to get a degree in something. And once I got there, it just, I excelled, but it wasn't what I wanted to be doing. The small conversations it drained me. And so I wanted to be working with my hands. I wanted to do something more. And, after I graduated from college, I actually went and I was a firefighter full-time for about 5 years. And as fun as that was, I love the problem-solving side of it, but I still was just reaching for that, what do I want to be doing with my life? And whereas a lot of people have the pivot in their like 40s, 50s when kids leave the house or things like that, or their second careers in their life, I had that pretty early and got recruited in 2017 by my now business partner, Ty, to join at that time, a historic window restoration company called Wood Window Rescue. And in 2017, I came in and he was in the middle of filming an HGTV pilot, which being restoration based was the highest cost, the least amount of sponsors. And we were trying to be the follow up to Fixer Upper. So it was just the recipe of ingredients there didn't go too well for the HGTV show. But at that point in time, we spent from 2000, he started in 2016. through 2020 being just a historic window restoration company, doing projects really from Dallas to Kansas City. And um, in 2020, we were launching Dallas and Kansas City satellite location, with the launch dates of being March of 2020.
Ooh.
And everybody can kind of fill in the details at that point in time of it was an immediate pivot of what are we going to do? How are we going to do this differently? And at that point in time, it was let's leverage the information and the expertise that we've gained in really kind of becoming regionally known in the window restoration field, to doing more exterior envelope historic preservation projects. And so there we were, March of 2020, Oklahoma City shut down. Within a week, we rebranded to Old Home Rescue. And there was still, we rebranded Old Home Rescue doing those exterior projects and kind of just doing whatever we can through those next several months. But we felt this underlying, there was a need to expand this. There was a need for the knowledge that we have learned to grow more and do more. And we're still currently running Old Home Rescue, which has morphed its way into a historic preservation general contractor focusing on historic homes, buildings, and really museums, loving telling the stories of our past. And then in 2021, we instead of launching satellite locations, we reformulated what that growth strategy was, and we launched a preservation franchise that focuses on wood rot repairs. I know you guys are in the Houston area, so that Gulf area is a level 5 rot area where there's you can walk down the block and there's rot on every houses. And so we have formed what we believe is the first preservation franchise in the United States.
That's awesome. So there's a lot to kind of go back and unpack there. The first thing I want to touch on is kind of how you didn't set out to do this. You know, you went to school for one thing, thought you're going to do something else, and kind of transitioned into this. And not to dive too deep on this, but you know, I had a similar path. You know, I was a music major in college and thought I was going to either play or teach music for a living. And then I was in the restaurant business for a while before I got into construction.
That's a massive difference from being a building science expert now.
I mean, big shift. I mean, much like you know, pharmacy and sports science to restoration too, right? But I think that you know, not to downplay the importance of college, because I loved my time in college. I think it's a great experience for any person to have, whether or not they're going to pursue what they're studying or not. It's a great just growth experience. And I think everybody that can go to college should at least give it a shot. But you know, as you know, there's so many fantastic jobs and careers out there, be it in you know, the trades, just in construction and in general, that don't require a college degree. And if a kid who's interested in that can and should consider an apprenticeship or some sort of vocational training out of school, and don't get pushed into that I have to go to college mentality. So that's my PSA. If people are listening and they have a kid who's likes to work with their hands, don't force them to go to college. Like, encourage them, because they can make really good money as a general contractor, a subcontractor, a tradesperson, whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, like, I remember being that high school student who was excelling, and because a teacher thinks you're a counselor, guidance counselor thinks you're smart, that you should go be an engineer. Well, I mean, I actually started out doing that when I got to college, and it just didn't fit who I was. Running my personality test now, I know who I am very well, but it's allowed me to, coming into the trades, there's so many opportunities out there for people to truly make a 6-figure income in trades in general, but then historic preservation trades. The trade shortage that we have is, I think it's only going to get worse over the next several decades. And until we make a strategic shift at like the high school level, shifting people into something different. But then whether you're going into school and you do construction management or or you want to leave high school and enter the trades and enter that apprenticeship, but going and niching down into the historic preservation trades, this is one of those areas that I would love if I had a dozen painters to choose from. But because things are so much different on historic preservation, I've got, instead of a queue of 6 to 12 subcontractors, I have a queue of one or two in our painting and masonry and everything like that. And I know that there's so much opportunity out there that I wish more people were, one, diving into the trades, and then two, diving into preservation trades.
I have a kid who's working for us right now who just started a few months ago, and he's fresh out of college. I think he studied sports science or something in college. He was captain of a college football team, and after college, he got married and didn't know what he wanted to do, but he knew he didn't want to sit in an office, and he didn't want to do anything that he went to school for. He's like, man, I wouldn't even have gone to college if it wasn't for football. That's the only reason I went, was to play football. And now that I'm out, I don't want to do any of that stuff. He's like, I want to work with my hands. I want to learn construction. And so he came to work for us. And just think, I'm not saying it's a waste of time. He played college football, had a great experience, but if a kid like that were to come straight to us, at 18 or 19 years old instead of 23, 24, they'd already be 5 years ahead of the curve on learning things and making money. And instead of starting off at, whatever he's making, 50 or 60 grand a year, could be making 90 or 100 by now. So
absolutely. And there's that opportunity if we will push our kids, that the trades are an option for them.
Yeah. All right. Sorry. So that was a total side topic that I didn't mean to get into, but I from your experience and from my experience, I just kind of felt like we should touch on that. So let's talk about historic buildings. We see the terms, historic preservation and restoration and remodel, repair, these different terms kind of thrown about. But they really mean very different things. And especially when you're talking about like a true historic structure. So if you're working with, whether it's a home that's in the historic district, I know here in Houston, we have several historic districts, and what you can do on those houses is restricted. And I'm sure some in Oklahoma City and in your market, I know that you guys have worked on like downtown buildings that might be historic buildings or museums or things like that, right? And so when you're working on those types of buildings and you're bidding these things and talking to the people making decisions, there's a big difference in this terminology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and it's kind of getting caught in the weeds sometimes, but it's important to understand because, one, I love telling this, that by the National Park Service, who kind of governs the historic treatment of buildings, or the treatment of historic buildings, the definition of a historic structure is 50 years or older. That means 1973 is considered a historic building. I know there's a few cases, even up to like a mid-80s building in St. Louis that recently got put on the National Register of Historic Places, which is really crazy to think about. And it's sent the National Park Service into kind of this frenzy of like, we don't even have preservation briefs, which are like the technical instructions and guidelines on what you should do and how you should do it for these buildings. They don't even have them written for these eras of buildings. But so that's kind of what the National Park Service defines as historic, is 50 plus years old. Inside of that, it's really critical to know that restoration is taking the building or the items that you're working on back to original form and function. So a historic window restoration includes restoring it to its original appearance, but also its original function as well. But you have this other word called preservation. That's preservation boils down to maintenance and repairs. And with historic structures and components of historic buildings, it gets to be a lot of labor. There's also a lot of rules that you have to follow in a certain way that you have to do it. So sometimes we can hit these really labor-intensive projects if we go with a historic restoration project. but you have some ability working through your state historic preservation office to shift that scope of work into a preservation mentality, maintenance and repairs. And that's really what a lot of historic structures have struggled with, is the lack of maintenance. When it comes to our cars, we would balk at the idea of never buying a new car and then never changing our oil for the first 100,000 miles. But when we buy a home, we do basically that, where we buy these homes. They had it painted by the cheapest painter possible prior to you buying it, and then all of a sudden, 3 or 5 years later, it starts to peel, and we get immune to it because it's an old home. And next thing you know, we've gone 10, 15 years living in that house, and then we do the same thing. And it creates this deferred maintenance cycle where we're never actually getting out in front of the deferred maintenance. And so that's preservation, restoration. You also have rehabilitation. That means that kind of like the building that I'm in now, which is called the H Street Marketplace. It's a historic building here in Oklahoma City where it previously served as one function, and they're coming in and changing the intended use of the building. And in that, they're preserving some elements, they're restoring some elements, but then the overall function of the building itself has changed from its original intended use.
On some of these buildings, I think it's it's hard to know sometimes like what's even worth saving. I think sometimes people, whether it's a house people buy or sometimes even developers get into this thing where they buy a building and then once they buy it, they realize or they start thinking, why did I buy this? And so, what are kind of the considerations to even think about, if is this building even worth messing with?
That is probably one of the toughest things in historic preservation is that cost benefit analysis. One of the hardest things about historic preservation is knowing how far to go, how far to push back into restoration and preservation and things like that. And so it takes a lot of creative problem solving and value engineering. In a project that we're working on now, they sent some blanket specs for a window restoration project as part of a multi-building complex historic tax credit project. And the way the specs came across, it was like the Cadillac of window restoration, while also not having probably the best end result as far as building science goes to those structures, because the way they wrote the specs on it, it pushes you into, for us on that project, it was like a $1.2 million window restoration project.
Wow.
And lots of conversations with the general contractor of like, I truly don't even want to do this level of project because I think we can do the exact same end result by shifting our historic preservation brief and getting into it a little bit more from preservation brief 9 to preservation brief 10 means that we're going from window restoration to exterior paint. And by doing something as simple as that, you can cut almost 60% out of your project cost while also adding a storm window to it so that you have your decreased air infiltration and energy efficiency benefits and all of those other things. But when we strictly take a lot of historic preservation specs as like those copy and pasted from architect to architect without being able to collaborate on the beginning phase of things, we can really elevate costs without having a hold on a return on the end result.
I realize that when we're talking about houses, the money part of this conversation is not always the most important, because if people have a love for historic homes, or if they bought that house because of its sentimental value, historic value, whatever that is, money might not be the big driver, right? So even though it doesn't make financial sense to do it, sometimes they still go ahead and do it just out of the love of preservation and the love of history, right?
There are those people that I love when we do our, we call it contactless consultation. It's the first call that we have that with homeowners usually, or building owners. And sometimes you just know when people are in it for the right reasons, because they'll say, I just want to be a steward of this home. They don't think about it as I'm living here for the next 3 to 7 years. They truly think about it that it's their timeline on the history of of this home and this neighborhood, which then compounds to this city.
I mean, we could go down a whole rabbit hole about talking about homes being disposable to some degree, especially certain eras of homes being disposable. Here, most of our, quote unquote, historic homes that are in the historic districts in Houston are kind of like the pre 1940, let's say. So they fall kind of like the 1900 to 1930s. And that's kind of the most common. Houston's not as old of a city as some of the places on the East Coast are, where you're dealing with really old structures. But, once you kind of get into the post-war era, 40s, 50s, and on, at least here in Houston, a lot of the houses were built really quickly. They were never really meant to be kind of long-term housing stock. And so I think that's kind of why we think of those homes more as disposable, because they were kind of like the track homes of their day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're very similar here in Oklahoma City, where those early, so Oklahoma City comes about the land run in 1889, and then those initial homes that were built over the next 10, 15, 20 years, a lot of those were torn down as the city developed and pushed out into what are now our historic neighborhoods, where it really starts in the 19 teens through, again, the 1940s, just like you guys. But same thing, we have those 1940s, 50s post-war houses that were just thrown together for families coming back and having their homes after World War II and things like that, where there's definitely some quality questionabilities there.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I don't think there are very many houses that were probably intentionally built to be really long-term houses. Like I think even a lot of the stuff that, well, definitely the stuff here in Houston that was built, let's say in the 1920s and 30s, most of that was never thought of as I'm building something that's going to be here for the next 300 years. Most of those were little shotgun houses, cottages. A lot of them were like a Sears kit house, even out of the Sears catalog. But now we look back and say that has historic value, whereas at the time it was just another typical house getting thrown up, right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's these large developers of that era who they were making spec homes. I mean, even in some of these homes, they were using cheap stuff, from hardware to other things, but it's just a difference of like quality over the decades, because in in a lot of these repairs, we get the unique ability versus a lot of people who do remodels on 1980s through newer homes. We get the ability to look at something that's 120 years old, and you get to see this timeline of like how things were built, but how they were repaired in the 40s, and then they were repaired again in the 50s. And a lot of times we start to see a drastic decline in the quality of the repairs come the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, just because our wood quality goes down. And that's a lot of the historic value, even with some of the mistakes that have been made on these homes over their lifetime. The fallback is that they're built with rot resistant wood, with true dimensional lumber, with high quality bricks, and either a Portland lime based mortar versus what we have now being used in those homes.
Right. I work in these houses. You work in these houses. So we both seen probably a lot of different issues, but there's probably like kind of some common recurring issues that you find over and over in a lot of these structures. I know obviously the big one, and this is one of the reasons that you guys are in business, are windows, and that's related to wood rot and weather. And I think a lot of building problems in general can be related to weather and water and stuff like that, right? But in the historic preservation restoration space, what would you say are the most common types of failures or issues that you come across?
So just starting with the roof down, very simple issues that for most people who are going to be listening to this podcast think is like a no-brainer. But a lot of times that we're seeing 5-figure repairs needed on homes because of a missing kickout flashing. Because of the fact that we went from a roof with skip decking and cedar shake shingles to now we put solid sheathing on top of it and shingles, and we raised that up, but we saved 10 cents a foot or whatever it is for a 1 inch drip edge versus a 2 inch. And when you make that small of an error, it allows that water to drip into your soffits. And next thing you know, you just have water and mold and rot, and it's just a mess of things. So it's not that we are seeing these catastrophic failures. It's in the details of getting something from 90% to 100% and just taking those details into consideration. With the roof, like I said, it's mostly flashing. In our drip edge issues, we've had a number of those over the last few years that we've faced. When it comes down the wall to painting, wood use, and repairs and stuff like that, another instance is we recently looked at a museum that 7 or 8 years ago, it was a pre-statehood hotel. Like, think about those Wild West hotels that you see. It was one of those. Absolutely amazing. Well, the paint had started flaking too much, and they decided that the less expensive route was going to be, let's just pull it off, let's put some house wrap on it, and then let's re-side it. Well, key issues that they missed there are, do we have a rain screen? And then any new wood that we're using, which is in our area, like a southern yellow pine and stuff like that for those novelty sidings. Anytime we're putting a new wood on the exterior of any building, we have to prime it on all sides. And then we cut it to length, and we have to prime our end cuts and then install it. And what I saw when I looked at this historic motel was that every butt joint on the entire building was rotting. Every wood drip edge, that they do the detailing perfectly on what it should look like, the moldings that it should be, the returns on the crown molding underneath it, on the header casing and everything. It was perfect, except for the fact that they used a low quality wood that wasn't primed on all sides. And 8 years later, 8 years later, that house or that motel is rotting all over the place and needs an incredible amount of epoxy repairs to it, or it needs to start fresh like they were 8 years ago.
So the problem wasn't so much like the original structure, right? The problem was when they went back and did the repair, they created more issues, kind of like on the roof you're talking about, like the original roof design, the original roof install was probably fine for a long time, but when they went back and re-roofed it and put the new drip edge on there, that's where the mistakes were made.
Yeah. So, like I said, the majority of issues that we end up seeing aren't the original building materials, and the original building construction is most often still in really good condition. Even windows that have been neglected for decades upon decades, they still do really well. It's when we start incorporating new technology or new woods, and we start merging them with historic without heavy consideration, those two start to really conflict each other. And about the time we start adding air conditioners to buildings and doing all of these remodels, is that as these buildings are 20, 30 years old, we start to see the implications of those things merging pretty heavily.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that is that over the years, maybe 10 years ago, they probably or whenever the roof was changed out, right? They got some roof quotes. They probably picked the cheapest or middle roof quote, and they didn't really vet the quote, and they didn't read the specs. They didn't see 1 inch versus 2 inch drip edge, and whoever made the decision to put that new roof on didn't really kind of go through the right selection process. And the same thing with the siding. They're like, oh, we just got a quote for some siding, let's do it, without really thinking through the right way to do that to preserve their building.
Yeah, and I mean, with where new construction is at in high performance buildings, and the thought that has to go into that, and the pre-construction services and all of those things to slow down on the front end, and then so you can move forward with a really high quality project. Well, it's the same way with historic, that we need to slow down. We need to understand why we need to do these things and how we need to do things. And a $7 piece of kickout flashing solves a $25,000 repair on a home.
Yeah. What are some other kind of modern applications of materials and techniques that you can think of that cause problems on historic structures? I mean, I guess one that springs to mind for me is insulation. And I've talked about this with toner before, where people they go in and they slap some spray foam insulation, or they change kind of the airflow pattern through the structure with different types of insulation. Is that something that you deal with up there in your area as well?
So because we focus on the exterior building envelope, we don't deal with it as much. However, we recently finished a project where the homeowners are dealing with the implications of that. It's a close to 3,000 square foot former sorority house, and they had an interior contractor do the remodel on it. Did a really great job, but maybe didn't take into account the building science and HVAC implications of that, and then spray foamed the entire historic structure. What they have now is a massive humidity issue that's going on. We're on the back end of that, where we're going to be installing some storm windows for the air infiltration side of things and energy efficiency. Um, but it's actually something I referred him to you guys to maybe have you guys come up and take a look at that, because it's an issue where he was dumping gallons and gallons of water every single day from his home just to keep up with the humidity differences that have been affected by the new heat and air unit, and plus the spray foam in that home.
So I guess the lesson in kind of that, and the last few things that we've talked about with the roofing and the siding, all that kind of stuff, is it goes back to our whole concept of properly planning the project. It's like you need to hire these people who are experts in these areas. You've got to hire people who, not just the cheapest guy. You got to hire the company that is well versed in preservation if you're a historic structure, or people that can help you diagnose, or not diagnose because that would be after the fact, but help you plan how the changes that you want to make with your HVAC and your insulation, how all that's going to play together to give you a well performing house, building, structure, whatever. Right. Let's talk specifically about windows for a little bit, because I know that's again kind of what you guys have really focused on, and also Preservan. That's your wood rot repair franchise, but that I think probably mostly deals with windows. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of its work does revolve around windows and doors, just because there's a high cost of replacement to those things.
I mean, it's easy to change out a piece of siding, generally speaking, but if there's a problem with the window and the door, it's not going to function. I know here in Houston, on our historic districts, they require us to keep the original windows. Like, there's no option; we have to keep the windows. And so what that means is, in order to meet other codes, for example, the egress code, so for people to be able to get out of the bedroom in case of a fire, or for firefighters to be able to come into the home in case of fire, you have to meet this egress code. But I would say that on probably a majority of these old houses, the old wood windows that had the pulleys and ropes and lead weights and all that stuff, they were painted shut many years ago and haven't operated in a very long time. But now we have to preserve those windows and bring them back to a functioning state. So that's what you guys do.
Yeah. So this is where we started in 2016. My business partner Ty was he was that ignorant contractor who came into a historic neighborhood for a fire and water rescue. It's his first historic remodel or restoration project that he did. He tore out some diamond light windows out of the front elevation. You know, those like amazing gable in diamond light windows. He threw them in the trash. And next thing you know, the Historic Preservation Commission was coming up and saying that you can't do this. And what happened from there is that he was like, well, tell me who can. And they gave him three names. The first one didn't answer. The second one said, thanks for calling. I'm a month before I can give you an estimate. And then I'm 6 months before I can get you the windows. And then the third one was an older gentleman that's about 90 miles away who said, I'm getting ready to retire, but come down and I'll show you everything I know. And that took this fire and water restoration business to let's work on historic buildings. And then it was just this extreme need for historic window restoration. And that's really where we spent from 2016 and 2020, and really is our niche now, where we do a lot of work. But it can be incredibly complicated, but it can also be simplified a lot too. In working, so if you as a general contractor are working on a project in Houston or wherever, if there are alternatives to window restoration and window replacement, if you have grants or things paying like that for your windows, it makes a whole lot of sense to do the full blown window restoration. But I think I heard you guys in a previous podcast talking about like it could be $3,500 a window, and that's absolutely true because for somebody to restore a 1/1 window or even a 6/6 window, that's 25 to 35 hours of work plus material, and prices can escalate quickly, and then they've got to follow the RRP, let's say rules, and all of that for an occupied structure. So how do we make something work that's an alternative to that? And when we made those pivots through COVID, I started going back out, doing more consulting, and really listening to people and starting to develop our specifications after some paint failures. And what we found was that people really just want their rot repaired, their windows to look great, maybe a dozen of them in all of the 45 windows in the house to open, and then they want them to be energy efficient. So how do you do that in a historic structure? That's kind of where Preservan came into play. In 2021, we started our growth strategy for how are we going to do more with what we've been doing. We did that through we started a franchise that is a home service based. It's based out of a Kia Soul, and they carry a few different types of epoxy products, and they can come and whether you're in a historic structure or you're in a high-end neighborhood that's around a lake, it has a gate on it, or a golf course, or wherever that is, and they've had those covenants restrictions to say you have to have wood windows. Well, this was a case where in 2019, we actually won an award for a national award for reproducing this amazing 8 foot wide by 12 foot tall window. And it was really cool, except for the fact that we were in the person's home for about 2 weeks. We manufactured it offsite, got on site. It was an inch too tall, had to make some site modifications. A piece of glass broke and it just like spiraled. And all of that could have been fixed because there was this much rot on the bottom quarter of that window because the sprinkler was watering the house and not the flower bed. And that's so whether it's a newer construction home, it's got those wood windows on it. We've been able to develop a service that allows us to complete repairs in about 48 hours. We come out and we can fix this much rot on one window, because when the window replacement person comes in, you have to worry about, well, this one window needs repaired or fixed. So my only option is to replace it. Well, if it's a standard window, it's $2,500 to $3,500, and it's going to be a 24-week timeline. And on top of all of that, it's not going to match the rest of the windows in your house. So let's replace them all, and all of a sudden it's $85,000.
Yeah.
So that's where we've done a lot of rot repairs to kind of bridge that gap. And with Preservan, it's about 90% less than replacement. And then even on the painting side of it, for a historic window, we teach workshops and we do our window restoration, preservation work, but it allows us to come in and use a high quality painting process for typically the exterior that's kind of been neglected. And that is a cheaper alternative to the full blown window restoration package. And then a lot of times it's coming in on the back end and adding a storm window to it, so that you have that energy efficiency and air infiltration decrease.
You know, one of the things that people don't think about when they think about replacing windows, because I have this conversation all the time on sales calls for our construction business, is that domino effect that takes place with remodeling in general. But you know, if you want to replace the window, well, now you've got drywall repair, you've got trim repair on the inside, you might have some brick repair, some siding repair on the outside, and so you know, while that actual window might only be, you know, if it's a kind of like a national brand replacement window, that window might be $800 or $1,000 for a good quality wood window. It's all the other things that go into it It's so that $1,000 window turns into $3,000 or $4,000 job for one. Plus, you have the inconvenience of all that dust and hot air coming into the house or cold air, depending on the time of year. And so, replacing windows in an occupied structure is not a fun process usually. And I can speak to that because I just did it on my own house last year. So I had holes all over my house last year, so I hated it. But yeah, so it's that domino effect that people don't think about. And if you can cut that down to, you know, to 1 or 2 days for one window, or maybe even a week if you're there working on several windows, aside from the cost, it's just the disruption in life that you're saving as well, right?
It's incredibly intrusive into your life because now you're taking off work because you've got to let all of these people in your house. And it's the unintended consequences of, are they an RRP certified firm? So pre 1978, you have lead paint that's involved that gets disturbed and goes through your house. And they just opened up all 24 windows in your house. And then on top of all of that, is it installed appropriately? So that's probably one of the biggest fail points in Windows in general, is the improper installation. So in our paths with subcontractors, we've had one who came in and wanted to work with us, and his claim that he was Lowe's #1 window installer, and he didn't appropriately flash a window on the entire house. And so we had to undo a whole bunch of stuff and go forward. But it's not only the cost of the window replacement at that point in time, but it's 5-10 years from now, as we've had some water infiltration and the framing's rotted out as well.
And we've touched on this in some past episodes, and I'd like to do an entire episode about kind of the two ways to do replacement windows, and that is doing the typical replacement window where they just go around and sawzall it out and pop the new one in, put some screws in, and caulk it. That's one method. We prefer, and it costs more money for sure, but we prefer to actually take off the brick or the siding around where that window is going and do a proper installation with a nailing flange, a nailing fin. And that way you can get in there, you can tape it, you can flash it, repair your brick, repair your siding. And yes, it takes more time and costs more money, but it's such a better install. And you're not relying on that little bead of caulking that runs around your window to protect your entire wall assembly from rotting out.
Yeah. A lot of times when people are doing this window inserts in a historic structure where they're just taking out the sashes and then just dropping a window into the existing frame, like I said, there's just a bead of caulking, if that, on a lot of those, because it's just a cheaper installation method. But we're practical preservationists. I understand that there's a time and place for window replacement or replacement of anything in that fact. But when it comes time to do a proper replacement window on a historic structure, a full frame replacement is definitely the way to go, so that you can make sure everything's taken care of in that installation process.
So back to Preservan and how you guys work on that. Is that an epoxy resin product that you're using for your repairs, or how are you doing that?
Yeah, so it is an epoxy resin that's been around for several decades now. The manufacturer it's been installed on a number of historic sites, from Mount Vernon, Monticello, Statue of Liberty, but we've actually worked with the manufacturer to tailor that to our specific locations. So it's the building science behind it is kind of like boring, but the end result for the user it's so fun, because it is coming in and, say, Curtis, you have one window rotted on your house, or like the bottom of that front entry door, the grand entrance, but that door is $12,000 to replace. What we can do is come in, and our technician shows up in a Kia Soul, unpacks a handful of tools. They dig out all of the rot, and then they use a 2-part consolidant to not only just where the rot is, but all of the areas around it. They'll pre-drill with an 1/8-inch drill bit, push a whole bunch of consolidant inside of it, and then they mix a 2-part epoxy on top of it. And that's just like molding clay, where they can kind of shape it and form it and all of that stuff. And then we leave for a day. And on the about 24 hours later, we come back. and we can sand it and paint it. And from about 6 feet away, you'd never know that it's there. And it's incredibly convenient and so much less expensive than and intrusive than replacing that front door, those windows.
Do you guys also get into doing the other types of repairs that we talked about, like the ropes and the pulleys and the lead weights, and then like replacing, like the old glass and trying to match the old wavy glass and all that kind of stuff? Is that a service that you also get involved in?
Yeah, so with Old Home Rescue, that's definitely something that we do. More often than not, it tends to be on the small commercial side of things, museums and things like that. But yeah, it's been a 6 year database building of, if it's this particular type of waviness in a glass, then it's that manufacturer versus this one, and going in and re-roping all those windows. If the weights are missing, who do we get them from? And there's a really good Window Preservation Alliance is a really good organization that we've been able to combine some information between all of us. And really interesting, they got about 8 or 10 window restoration professional companies from the U.S. to come together with 1 or 2 architects, and they wrote a window restoration specification from their perspective with their products and all of those things. So that's been kind of a database that everybody who joins this industry can jump in, and they get a 6 year head start on where we were.
Preservan, though, is basically just focused on doing the rot repairs and not necessarily getting into all those other sorts of things, right?
So Preservan is just our wood rot repair company.
Got it.
There where you guys are in the Gulf, and then up basically to DC is what the AWPA calls a level 5 rot deterioration zone. I feel like you put a piece of wood outside, it's rotted by the next day. And so we've basically developed the home service business that allows people to come in and work in their own neighborhoods. For us here in Oklahoma City, we work in about 10 neighborhoods, and that's it. Not like the whole city, but just those particular micro markets where we get to work with truly our neighbors.
That's great. So if people are interested in Preservan, and there's not, well, I guess 2 things here. If they're interested in doing this as a business, if they love preservation and want to be a Preservan franchisee, how do they go about doing that?
They can go to gopreservan.com. That'll give them all of the information that they need to know, and then they'll start being able to get in contact with us, and we can walk them through that whole process.
Awesome. And then kind of back to the general historic and the window stuff. Specifically, I wanted to back up because I was asking if Preservan did these kinds of things, but for Old House Rescue on the window rebuilding, what types of things typically go wrong with these windows? Because again, they're not complicated, right? There's the sashes, there's the weights, the pulleys, and the glass. But what goes wrong on those windows aside from just wood rot, obviously?
Yeah. So when you're working on a window restoration project, best thing that you can do is restore the windows that are existing. However, if they're not there, or you have to build replica sash, the biggest thing is that you have to choose a high quality wood that you're going to replace them with. We have the manufacturer that we bought out in 2017 who's using poplar. He was trying to value engineer some projects, and they ended up rotting about 5 years later. Whenever we're seeing, cypress isn't what it used to be. Spanish cedar isn't what it used to be. Those types of things. So high quality woods, whenever we do it, if you're looking for a locally sourced, for us, that's sapele we use a lot of. However, our go-to has always been Akoya. It's 50-year rot warranty. There's nothing better that I love putting my name to than a company that wants to warranty wood rot for 50 years.
Just like you mentioned in your market, there's not many people here in our market that do true window restorations. I made some of the same mistakes that Ty made when I was younger, 20 years ago. I'd go in and start tearing those things out, and people were like, wait, you can't do that. And so I tried to find the guys to restore windows. And it was the same problem that I came across. It's like, oh, there's one old guy over here that does window restorations. And there's another company, but they're booked out 6 months or more. So we kind of did something similar. One of our carpenters just said, hey, we're good carpenters. We can figure out how to do this. So let's just take a window out, take it apart, and learn how to do it. So we started doing our own windows. But it's a skill and you have to be a good finish carpenter to be able to disassemble those, do all the stuff to them, and put them back together.
Yeah, and it's one of the trades that I have seen that there's so much of a crossover between, and you need several different skill sets because not only are you a good carpenter to fix the window itself once it's out or trim it once it's trying to go back in, but you're also a glazer, you are a painter, and then you're this like weird window mechanic because historic windows are something that you have to make look beautiful. You have to make them go up and down, and they have to be weather stripped. So it's a lot in hiring for employees, and for you guys doing it in the past, it's a cumbersome thing to do sometimes.
It's honestly hard to make money on doing trim carpentry as a general contractor. It's something that we have an in-house carpentry staff here, um, but it's hard to get people to want to pay for those skills, especially in the market that we're in here that has a good bit of cheap labor. It's there's not many people who want to pay top dollar for a real craftsman to work on their project.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that we understand with historic preservation is that sometimes people get into these homes in these designated neighborhoods. They don't realize what they're getting into and they don't realize the cost. And so a lot of times we'll do workshops that teach from a preservation mindset. And really our goal when we did them a handful of years ago, it was uh, we taught the traditional method and it pushed all of these people out. They got overwhelmed. And then 6 months later, they'd call us back to do the work. And that's not what we intended to do. But the alternative to that is that we modified what that workshop looks like and have really said, like, this is what I want you to go be able to do in a weekend. And if you're not going to do it in a weekend, then I've provided you with a scope of work that you can hand to a local painter. And if they will just follow like half the rules on this sheet, it'll be 10 times better than if they would have tried to figure it out themselves. And they also would have priced it appropriately so that they don't go out of business too. And it's really a win from all situations. And so that's where it's been able to bring in Preservan and do the rot repairs, bring your local painter, have him do the exterior, and then put a storm window on it. So you lengthen out that maintenance cycle from 10 years to 20 years. That's ultimately the best path for a residential window project in a historic neighborhood.
I wish we had a Preservan here in Houston because we're on a project right now where a historic house actually was like a 1950s or 60s house, but it's a former governor's mansion. It had some very unique bowed wood windows that were all rotted, and we couldn't find anybody to repair them. And we ended up ordering replacement windows, and they were $15,000 a piece.
Yeah.
Having your product here in this market would have saved that homeowner a lot of money and a lot of time.
Yeah. And so we've got a franchise location in Orlando, Florida, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and we will be announcing one next month. Houston's a market that we would love to be in. So like I said, that Gulf Coast is a level 5 rot deterioration zone, which means that this is a prime area for somebody to be able to, whether they're working in construction and want to make a shift to something that's more niche, or they're looking to quit maybe their day job, or maybe that second half that they're just looking for something different. Preservan's perfect for something like that in the Houston market and a lot of other places throughout the U.S. where we're facing some rot deterioration. Also, residential spending is going down, and they don't want to spend those high COVID money projects that we're getting funded for quite some time. And so as those budgets kind of constrict, we're looking for something more convenient, sustainable, and affordable.
All right. Well, so we will be sure and link Preservan on our show notes, and I'm sure that Danielle will pop it on the screen when she's editing this as well. So if people who are listening or watching are interested in doing that, there's a big need for it. So if you want a new career or a new side hustle in Houston, definitely something people should check into. And we'll also be sure and link your stuff for Old Home Rescue too, because you guys are doing some cool work, and I really enjoyed watching your YouTube videos and listening to some of your podcasts as I was preparing for this. So, and y'all do some great stuff on Instagram, which is where we first connected as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me today, Curtis.
Thanks a lot for being here, Morgan. And thank you all for listening to this new episode of the Your Project Shepherd podcast, and we will see you next time. If you found us helpful and enjoyed listening, please support us by liking and subscribing here on your podcast platform, and also join us on our YouTube channel. We want to continue to bring you high-quality content and expert guests, and your support truly helps us to continue this journey. If you have any questions for me or my guests, or any feedback for us, you can email us at podcast@yourprojectshepherd.com. Thanks again.